Today we will hear the story of a clever detective who caught the criminal red-handed. Master Detective. Dr. Robert Fraser sat in his study, the faint smell of old books and pipe tobacco lingering in the air. He was lost in thought, flipping through medical journals, when the doorbell rang, cutting through the quiet. The sound was sharp, urgent. Robert looked up, his brow furrowing. Who could be calling at this hour? He rose from his chair, his shoes tapping lightly against the wooden floor as he made his way to the door. As he opened it, he was greeted by a figure he hadn't expected. Mrs. Claire Hutchinson, her face pale, her eyes wide with worry. "Dr. Fraser," she said breathlessly, stepping forward, "I need your help. It's Sherman. He's gravely ill." Robert's heart skipped a beat. Sherman Holt had been a dear friend for many years. The two had shared more than their fair share of adventures, many of them in far-flung corners of the world. But now, hearing Mrs. Hutchinson's distressed tone, Robert's mind raced. "What happened?" Robert asked, his voice steady but concerned. "What's wrong with him?" Claire's eyes filled with fear as she spoke, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to explain it. He's sick. So sick, Robert. It came on so suddenly. He's burning with fever, his skin is blotchy, and he's delirious. I've never seen anything like it. And what's worse, he said it's contagious." A chill ran down Robert's spine. He had seen his share of odd illnesses during his time as a doctor, but nothing like this. Nothing that struck so quickly, and with such dire consequences. "What kind of illness are we talking about?" he asked, his voice calm, though his mind was racing. "It's like nothing I've ever heard of before," she replied, wringing her hands. "The doctors in the area have no idea what it is. I've tried to get him treated, but nothing works. I'm scared, Robert. I'm scared for him, and for everyone else." Dr. Fraser felt a sense of urgency building within him. He knew he couldn't waste any more time. "I'll come with you," he said firmly. "We'll figure this out, Claire. Take me to him." Without another word, Claire nodded, turning quickly to lead the way. Robert followed, his mind already racing through possible diagnoses, his medical training on full alert. But as they walked, a lingering question gnawed at him. What could possibly be so contagious, so deadly, that it left Claire in such a state of panic? They arrived at Sherman's home, a grand old townhouse nestled in a quiet part of London. But now, as they approached, there was a palpable sense of dread hanging in the air. The windows were dark, no lights flickering through the drawn curtains. It felt abandoned, like something terrible had already transpired within those walls. Claire opened the door slowly, her hand shaking as she turned the knob. "Sherman," she called out softly, but the sound of her voice seemed to echo unnervingly in the stillness. "Claire, Robert," came a faint, raspy voice from the next room. It was Sherman, but the sound of his voice was barely recognizable, muffled and weak. They rushed to his side. Sherman was lying in bed, his face flushed with fever, beads of sweat dotting his forehead. His eyes, usually sharp and clear, were dull and glazed, his body racked with tremors. The sight of his old friend in such a state made Robert's heart ache. "Sherman, my friend," Dr. Fraser said softly, pulling a chair closer to the bed and leaning over him. "What's going on? Can you tell me what happened?" Sherman's eyes flickered open, though his gaze seemed distant, almost lost. He mumbled something that Robert couldn't quite make out. His breath came in shallow gasps. "The sailors," Sherman croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "They came from China. They brought it with them." Robert's brow furrowed. "The sailors?" he asked. "What are you talking about, Sherman?" Sherman's eyes blinked slowly as he tried to focus. "In London, met them at the docks. Strange men. Spoke a language I couldn't understand. They were sick, but I didn't think it would. It's spreading. I'm sorry." His voice trailed off as his body convulsed with a fit of coughing. The sound was sickening, wet, and deep, and it only made Robert more certain that this was no ordinary illness. Robert turned to Claire, who stood anxiously at the door, her hands wringing in constant motion. "Claire," he said firmly, Get me some water and a clean cloth. We need to stabilize him." As she rushed to follow his instructions, Robert gently placed his hand on Sherman's forehead. The heat was unbearable, and the signs of a dangerous fever were clear. But what troubled him most was the mention of the sailors, foreign men, likely carrying an unknown contagion. Could this disease have spread through the docks, from person to person? Robert had ever seen before. "This is no ordinary fever," Robert muttered to himself, more to reassure his own mind than anything else. "We need to get samples. I'll need to examine them further, but this could be an outbreak. Something foreign." "What do you mean?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "What are we dealing with, Robert?" "I'm not sure yet," he replied, his gaze intense. "But we need to act quickly. If this is what I think it is, we may be dealing with something far more dangerous than we realize. And if it spreads—" He paused, the weight of the words settling over him. "We could be facing an epidemic." At that moment, everything in the room seemed to freeze, the reality of the situation crashing down on them both. Robert's mind raced, but there was no time to waste. He had to figure out what this was, and fast, before it was too late for Sherman and for everyone else. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of uncertainty. Dr. Fraser sat at Sherman's bedside, his hands still warm from the cloth he'd pressed to his friend's fevered skin. Though the immediate danger of Sherman's symptoms had lessened slightly, Robert knew that this was only a brief respite. The illness was spreading, consuming his friend's strength little by little, and time was running out. "Sherman," Dr. Fraser said gently, his voice soft but urgent. "You mentioned something before, a cure? Who is Mr. Callum Smith? How can he help you?" Sherman's eyes fluttered open, barely able to focus, but his mind seemed to be clearing. He glanced at Robert, his face twisted with both exhaustion and the memory of a past he'd clearly hoped to forget. "Callum Smith," Sherman whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible above the rhythmic tick of the old grandfather clock in the corner. "He's the one. He was in Sumatra years ago. He eradicated a similar disease. It was a plague, much like what's taking me down now. He saved hundreds of lives." As Claire returned with the water and cloth, Robert's mind raced, thinking back to any diseases he'd encountered that might fit Sherman's symptoms. Fever, delirium, rash, and cough, all indicators of something far more serious than a common cold or influenza. It was clear now. Sherman's illness was not something. Dr. Fraser leaned in closer, his interest piqued. "A plague," he repeated. "What kind of disease are we talking about? How did he stop it?" Sherman's eyes drifted toward the ceiling, as if recalling the distant past. His breath hitched in his chest, but he pushed through it, his voice growing weaker with each word. It was brutal. People dying overnight. No rhyme or reason, just like this. Callum Smith. He was a doctor, a researcher. He managed to isolate the cause and develop a cure, some kind of serum. He saved so many lives, but Sherman's voice trailed off again, the words dying in his throat. He clenched his fists, a look of pain flashing across his face. "But what?" Robert pressed gently, trying to coax the story out of his friend. Sherman's eyes met his, and for a moment there was a flicker of something in his gaze, a hint of fear, or perhaps regret. "Smith," Sherman said slowly, each syllable weighed down by years of history. "He doesn't like you, Robert. He'll refuse to help you. I know it." Fraser's brow furrowed. "Why would he refuse to help me? I've never met the man." "Sherman, why would he turn me away?" Sherman took in a shallow breath and winced. "It's complicated. Years ago, when he was working in Sumatra, there was a tragedy. His nephew, a young boy, died suddenly. Poisoned, they said. Everyone pointed fingers, but no one could prove anything. The boy's death destroyed Smith. And when it came out that you were involved in the investigation, well, let's just say he never forgave you for it." Dr. Fraser paused, his thoughts racing. He remembered the case all too well. It had been years ago, back when he was still trying to prove himself as a physician and investigator. He had been called in to look into the strange and sudden death of the young man in Sumatra. It was a case that had been marred by misinformation and conflicting reports. But one thing was certain. Callum Smith had been personally devastated by his nephew's death, and he had come to believe that Robert's involvement in investigation had somehow led to the boy's demise. The guilt, the anger, it was a storm that had raged between them for years. And now, here he was, standing on the edge of a new crisis, with the fate of his old friend in his hands, and the one man who might hold the key to saving him was someone Robert had not spoken to in over a decade. But if Smith has the cure, then I have to try, Dr. Fraser said, his voice unwavering, despite the knot of tension that had settled in his stomach. If he could save people back then, maybe he can save you now. Sherman shook his head weakly. Don't be a fool, Robert. Callum Smith, he's a bitter man. He's driven by his grief. You'll never get through to him. And even if you do, he might not have the serum anymore. It's been too long. There's no telling if it'll still work. Robert took a deep breath, trying to steady the pounding in his chest. It wasn't just Sherman's life at stake now. It was everyone else who might be exposed to this contagion. This was no time for hesitation, no time for pride. He had to find Smith, no matter the personal cost. I have no choice, Sherman, he said firmly. I will find him. I will convince him to help, whether he likes it or not. You're my friend, and I'm not going to let you slip away. Sherman's lips trembled, his eyes swimming with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. I wish I could be more hopeful, he whispered. But you don't know the man like I do. He's not the same since then. You were there, Robert. You saw how the case ended. We both know how it broke him. Dr. Fraser nodded silently, acknowledging the truth of Sherman's words. But that didn't change anything. He couldn't afford to let old wounds dictate the future. There was too much at stake now. Don't worry about that, Robert said softly, his voice tinged with resolve. I'll face whatever ghosts I have to, Sherman. You'll see. We'll get through this together. Sherman gave a weak nod, his eyes fluttering closed as he drifted in and out of consciousness. Robert's mind was already elsewhere, calculating the fastest route to Sumatra, considering how to approach Smith, how to break through the wall of anger and grief that had isolated him for so long. It was a delicate task, fraught with personal history and old resentments, but it was the only chance he had. Robert stood and moved toward the door, casting one last glance at his friend. Rest, Sherman, he said quietly. I'll be back as soon as I can. As he stepped into the hallway, a chill settled over him, not from the cold, but from the realization of what he was about to face. A man whose trust he had lost, a past full of accusations and misunderstandings, and a disease that was spreading like wildfire. If he couldn't find a way to reach Callum Smith, he knew that the consequences would be devastating. The clock ticked louder in the silence of the house, as if marking the moments slipping away, each one bringing him closer to a confrontation that he couldn't avoid any longer. Dr. Fraser stood in the middle of his study, the heavy silence around him almost suffocating. His mind raced with thoughts of Sherman, his friend, who was fading fast. It was the kind of fever that gripped a person with a merciless hold, and unless they found a cure, it would consume him completely. Sherman's words echoed in Robert's mind, Callum Smith. He might be the only one who can help. Robert had never been one to let past grudges dictate his actions. Still, the thought of seeing Callum Smith again stirred old memories, memories of bitter accusations and a friendship fractured beyond repair. But Sherman was right. If Smith had once cured a disease like this, he was the only chance they had. No matter the personal history between him and the eccentric doctor, Robert had a duty to save his friend. Fraser's decision was made quickly, but not without a heavy heart. He knew he would have to tread carefully with Smith. The man had become a recluse after the death of his nephew, and for years, the two men had avoided each other, their shared history too complicated to ignore. But the stakes were too high now. He had no time to dwell on the past. The journey to Sumatra was long and taxing, but Dr. Fraser knew that every moment counted. By the time he arrived, it was late in the evening, and the sky was cloaked in darkness, the air thick with the humidity of the jungle. He was met by a servant who guided him to Smith's estate, a sprawling, old manor that seemed to have been abandoned by time itself. The house had a musty smell, and the walls were lined with strange artifacts and shelves of books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. But it wasn't the house that caught Fraser's attention. It was the figure standing in the center of the room. Callum Smith was as Robert remembered him, disheveled, his hair wild and unkempt, his eyes sharp but clouded with sorrow. His face was older, more worn than the last time they had met, but there was still something unsettling about him, something in the way he held himself, as though the weight of the world had become too much to bear. "Robert Fraser," Smith said in a low, gravelly voice. "I never thought I'd see you again." Robert swallowed his discomfort, his mind focused on the task at hand. "I need your help, Callum. It's Sherman. He's gravely ill. It's a disease, something that's spreading. You're the only one who can help him." Smith's expression hardened, his lips curling into a tight frown. "And you think I'm just going to help you after everything? After what happened with my nephew?" "I didn't," Robert began, but Smith raised a hand to silence him. "Don't. I know exactly what you're going to say. The truth is, Robert, you may have had the best of intentions, but you failed. You failed my family, and you failed me. And now you come here, asking for my help." Robert's heart tightened, but he pushed through the guilt and anger. "Callum, I understand your pain, but this isn't about us. It's about Sherman. If we don't do something, he'll die. You've seen what this disease does. You were the one who stopped something like this before. Please, help him." There was a long pause. Callum's eyes softened for a brief moment, and Robert could see the conflict within him, the battle between his old bitterness and the man he once was. Finally, Callum sighed and looked away. "I'll help you," he said quietly, "but on one condition. You follow my instructions, exactly. No questions, no interruptions." Robert nodded, relief flooding through him. "I'll do whatever it takes." Smith motioned for Robert to follow him deeper into the house, through a dark hallway lined with strange, unsettling portraits. Eventually, they reached a small, dimly lit room at the back of the manor. On a mantelpiece in the center of the room sat an ivory box, its smooth surface gleaming softly in the low light. Robert's curiosity piqued immediately. The box was small, elegant, and strangely out of place in the room. It looked ancient, as though it had been passed down through generations. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and the carvings on the box seemed almost otherworldly. "Don't touch it," Callum said sharply, his voice tinged with an edge of panic. Robert froze, his hand hovering just inches above the box. "What is it?" he asked, his voice cautious. "Do not touch it, Robert," Callum repeated, his eyes locking onto Robert's with a sharp intensity. "That box is linked to the disease. I thought it was destroyed, but it seems it wasn't." Robert lowered his hand slowly, now understanding the gravity of the situation. "What do you mean? How is it connected?" Smith's face darkened. He walked over to the box, carefully running his fingers along its surface, as if ensuring it was still intact. "This box, it contains something that shouldn't exist. A pathogen, a curse. I've spent years trying to destroy it, to ensure it never resurfaces. But somehow, it's here again." Robert's mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what Smith was saying. "Are you telling me the disease that's killing Sherman is linked to that box?" Smith nodded solemnly. "Yes. The disease is a result of what's inside that box, an ancient strain of a virus that was once contained. It's been dormant for years, but now it's spreading, just like before. If we don't stop it, there will be no stopping the outbreak." The weight of the situation settled heavily on Robert's shoulders. "So what do we do?" Smith took a deep breath. "We have to destroy it. The box must be opened, the contents neutralized, and then we can begin working on a cure. But be warned, Robert, opening it will unleash more than just the virus. It will awaken everything inside." Fraser felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The danger was far greater than he had anticipated, but there was no turning back now. The fate of Sherman, and possibly many others, depended on what happened next. Dr. Fraser's heart pounded in his chest as he stood at the doorstep of Callum Smith's estate. The air was thick with the humid, oppressive heat of the jungle, and the scent of earth and decay hung heavily in the air. His mind raced. He had traveled far, faced old wounds, and now he stood on the precipice of the only hope he had for saving his dear friend Sherman. But the look in Smith's eyes earlier, the warning to stay away from the ivory box, still lingered in his mind, nagging at him. Something about Smith's reaction had unsettled him, and his instincts told him that there was more to this situation than met the eye. When the servant opened the door, the sight of Callum Smith was just as Robert remembered, a man disheveled, almost feral, as though the weight of years spent in isolation had cracked him open. But it wasn't the outward appearance that struck Robert most. It was the coldness in Smith's eyes, the deliberate distance he put between himself and Robert the moment their gazes met. "Dr. Fraser," Smith said, his voice clipped, offering nothing more than a curt nod. He stepped back, clearly not expecting any warmth in this reunion. "What do you want?" Robert tried to keep his composure, but there was no denying the tension that hung in the air between them. "I came because of Sherman. He's ill, Callum. You're the only one who might be able to help him. Please, we need your expertise." Smith's expression hardened. "I have no interest in helping anyone, least of all you. After what happened, I'm not in the business of saving lives anymore. You do well to remember that." Robert's pulse quickened, and he could feel the weight of the old animosity simmering between them. But he had no time for pride or anger. Sherman's life was at stake. "Callum," Robert said, his voice softening, "this isn't about the past. It's about saving a life. Sherman's life. This disease, it's like nothing I've ever seen before. You've dealt with something similar, haven't you? You've cured people. I know it's painful for you, but if you have any compassion left, you have to help." Smith stared at him for a long moment, his jaw clenched, before he shook his head, almost dismissively. "I'm sorry, but I don't know what you're talking about. I've never dealt with such a disease. You're mistaken." Robert's eyes narrowed. "You're lying." Smith flinched, but only for a second. His face became an impenetrable mask again. "I'm not lying. Leave. Now." Fraser's mind raced. There was no mistaking it now. Smith knew something, and he was hiding it. His refusal to acknowledge any knowledge of the disease wasn't just a simple rejection. It was a calculated move to keep Robert away. But why? The silence between them stretched longer than it should have, the air thick with tension. Robert's thoughts turned to the ivory box he had seen in Smith's home, and a sinking feeling settled in his stomach. That box, Smith's reaction to it. There was something connected, something deeper, something Smith wasn't telling him. Robert stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Callum, you're not going to walk away from this. You can't ignore it any longer. Sherman is dying. I know you know how to stop it, and I'm not leaving until you come with me. If not for him, then for your own peace of mind." Smith's eyes flickered for just a moment, a flash of something almost human, almost vulnerable. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold, distant man Robert had known for years. Smith turned away abruptly, heading toward a small table cluttered with papers. "You think you can just waltz in here and make demands? You think I owe you anything after everything that happened?" "I don't want anything from you, Callum," Robert said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "I only want to save my friend. Please, just come and see him. If you truly don't know what's happening, then help us figure out. If you're right, and you're not involved, I'll leave. But if you know something, anything, please tell me. I can't do this alone." Smith stood motionless, his back to Robert. For a long, unbearable silence, Robert thought that he might turn him away once more. But then, slowly, Callum's shoulders slumped, his posture faltering under the weight of the unspoken truth. "I will not be responsible for this," Smith muttered, barely audible. "Not again." Robert's heart skipped. The man was so close to cracking, but the words were still too vague. "What do you mean? What happened? Why aren't you telling me?" Smith turned abruptly, his face a mask of grief and anger. You don't know what it's like to lose someone you love, to have it all fall apart because of a mistake that you can never undo. His voice trembled, but he quickly regained his composure. Fine, I'll come with you, but don't expect me to fix everything. And if you touch that damn box again, I'll make sure you regret it. Robert nodded, trying to mask the growing suspicion that clung to him like a shadow. Smith's refusal to acknowledge the past, the box, the disease, it all seemed to be wrapped in layers of denial. But Robert couldn't afford to question him too much, not now. Sherman's life depended on the decisions they made in the coming hours. As they left Smith's house and made their way toward Sherman's, Robert kept his gaze fixed on the ground, his mind spinning with thoughts. What had Smith done? What had he been a part of? And why was he so reluctant to help now? The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to form, but the answers eluded him, just beyond his reach. When they arrived at Sherman's, the sense of urgency was palpable. Sherman lay in the same position as before, his breathing shallow and labored. Smith hesitated at the doorway, glancing over his shoulder at Robert. The two men shared a long, tense silence before Smith finally stepped into the room. Sherman's eyes fluttered open, and when he saw Smith, a flicker of recognition passed over his face. "You came," he whispered hoarsely. Smith nodded, but didn't speak. Instead, he moved to Sherman's side, his eyes scanning him with clinical detachment. But Robert could see it in his eyes. The hesitation, the guilt. There was something more, something he wasn't sharing. As the two men stood over Sherman's weakened form, Robert's suspicions only deepened. There was a darkness to Smith's involvement, something that went beyond simple reluctance. This wasn't just about a cure anymore. It was about a past neither of them wanted to confront. And as the truth slowly began to unravel, Robert knew one thing for certain. Nothing was as it seemed. The air inside Sherman's home was thick with tension as Callum Smith stepped into the room. His eyes scanned the space before settling on Sherman, who was lying motionless on the bed, his face pale and drawn. The disease had taken hold of him completely now. He was barely conscious, drifting in and out of fevered delirium. But Dr. Fraser noticed something different in the way Smith held himself, the way his eyes lingered on Sherman's frail form, as if something dark lingered beneath his apparent indifference. Smith's footsteps were heavy, each one deliberate, as though he was calculating every movement. Robert stood near the door, his arms crossed, watching carefully. There had been a sense of unease ever since Smith had agreed to come, an unease that had only deepened as the silence stretched between them. Sherman stirred, his eyes opening slightly as he registered Smith's presence. "You came," he rasped, his voice weak, but there was something more in his words, something akin to disbelief. Callum Smith didn't respond immediately. His gaze lingered on Sherman, then flicked toward Robert, a silent acknowledgement of their shared history. But it was clear now. This wasn't just about a cure. There was something deeper at play here, something Robert wasn't prepared for. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Smith spoke, his voice low and cold. "I never thought it would come to this, Sherman, but you've put me in a position I never wanted to be in." Sherman's brow furrowed in confusion, but Robert could feel the tension building, an invisible force growing in the room. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just about an illness anymore. This was something far more sinister. Smith continued, his tone dripping with a cold, calculated bitterness. "You've always been a thorn in my side. From the moment you arrived in Sumatra, I knew you'd never leave me alone. Your constant probing, your insistent questions, your search for answers. You never gave up, did you?" Robert's chest tightened as he stepped forward, a sense of dread settling over him. "What are you saying, Callum? What's going on here?" Smith turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Robert's. There was a venom in his gaze now, a malevolent satisfaction that sent a chill down Robert's spine. "It was you, Robert," Smith said, his voice barely a whisper. "You opened the package, the one that was meant for Sherman. And by doing so, you sealed his fate." A sharp breath caught in Robert's throat. "What do you mean? What package?" Smith's lips curled into a twisted smile, the kind of smile that revealed more than just a hint of madness. The virus, Robert. The one that's killing Sherman right now. I laced it inside the package that you so innocently opened. I knew you'd be the one to handle it. I've watched you, Robert. And now, thanks to you, Sherman is dying. Fraser's heart raced as the words crashed into him like a tidal wave. It was too much to comprehend, too dark a reality to accept. You deliberately infected him? Why? Why would you do such a thing? Smith took a step closer to the bed, his eyes never leaving Sherman's now alert face. Because Sherman was in the way. He always was. He knew too much, poking around, asking questions. And when he started getting too close to the truth, I knew I had to do something. So I framed him for a murder, one that I had committed myself. Sherman's eyes widened as he slowly began to piece together the horror of the situation. You, he whispered, his voice barely a breath. You killed him. You killed my nephew. Smith's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only cruelty. Your nephew was a liability, Sherman. He knew things. He was getting too close to the truth, just like you. I couldn't have him breathing, and I certainly couldn't have you around to ruin everything I've worked for. Robert's head spun. You framed him for murder. You've been playing a game this entire time. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It felt like a nightmare, one that he was powerless to escape. You've been using Sherman as a pawn in your twisted plan. Smith's eyes gleamed with a cold, dark satisfaction. That's exactly what I did, Robert. But now, it's too late. The disease is already spreading. Sherman will die, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. He's already been poisoned. Sherman's breath quickened, but he wasn't panicking. No, instead, there was something in his eyes now. Something sharp, something calculating. He looked at Smith with a mix of defiance and anger, though the disease was clearly taking its toll on his body. You won't get away with this, Callum, Sherman spat, his voice thick with hatred. I'll fight back, even if it's the last thing I do. Smith seemed to relish the moment, almost enjoying the torment he was causing. What are you going to do, Sherman? You're dying. There's nothing left for you to fight. But as Smith spoke, Robert noticed something in Sherman's eyes, a flicker of resolve. Sherman wasn't just lying there in agony. He was thinking, calculating. Slowly, painfully, Sherman raised his head off the pillow, a slow grin spreading across his face. You're wrong, Sherman said, his voice steady despite the tremors in his body. I'm not done yet. Smith looked at him in confusion, and for a moment, Robert could see the briefest flicker of doubt in his eyes. Sherman's plan was already in motion, but it wasn't about saving himself. It was about exposing Smith for the monster he truly was. Sherman wasn't just going to die quietly. He would make sure that Smith's crime was revealed, that the truth would come to light. Fraser could see what Sherman was doing, and a surge of admiration and fear flooded through him. Sherman, weakened by the poison, was playing a deadly game, a game where he pretended to be near death, drawing Smith in even closer, baiting him. He was buying time, waiting for the right moment to strike, to gather evidence against Smith. I know what you did, Callum, Sherman said, his voice taking on a new edge, one of cunning rather than desperation. And when I die, everyone will know it. You won't get away with it. I'll make sure of it. Smith's face twisted in rage. You think I'll let you expose me? You think anyone will believe the ramblings of a dying man? But Sherman was already one step ahead. His body may have been failing, but his mind was still sharp, and he was drawing Smith into his trap, playing on Smith's arrogance and sense of invincibility. As the minutes ticked by, it became clear. This was no longer just a race against time to find a cure. It was a fight for survival, not only against the disease, but against the man who had caused all. Sherman's breath grew ragged as he continued to lie, pretending to be on the brink of death. And in doing so, he forced Callum Smith to reveal more than he intended. With each passing second, the walls between truth and deception crumbled, and it became clear that the game was far from over. Sherman's body had grown weaker, each breath more labored than the last. The fever was consuming him, his mind clouded with the poison that had seeped into his veins. But despite the relentless ache of his body, Sherman's mind was sharp enough to see through the web of lies that Callum Smith had woven around him. And in this moment, as he lay there, pretending to teeter on the edge of death, Sherman was not simply trying to survive. He was playing a game, a deadly game where every move counted. Smith's back was turned to him, watching with a mixture of disdain and glee as Sherman struggled. It was clear that Smith believed he had already won. After all, Sherman was on the brink of death. What more could a man do in such a state? But Sherman had a plan. He had a way to turn the tables, to make Smith fall into his trap. Sherman's eyes flickered to the window, where he knew Inspector Thomas Brennan was lurking, waiting for the right signal. The inspector had been a silent partner in this battle all along, quietly observing from the shadows, ready to strike when the moment came. But for Brennan to move, for him to act, Sherman needed to get Smith to reveal himself, something that would force the inspector's hand. As he continued to feign weakness, Sherman's lips curled into the faintest smile. He couldn't afford to let Smith see any hint of his plan, not yet. For now, he had to keep the man off balance, make him think he was winning. "You won't get away with this, Callum," Sherman said hoarsely, his voice barely a whisper. He let his words hang in the air, heavy with meaning. His eyes locked onto Smith's back, watching for any reaction. Smith didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to the bed, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You're in no condition to threaten anyone, Sherman. You're dying. It's over." His voice was venomous, the satisfaction in his tone unmistakable. But Sherman's eyes remained steady, unwavering. He wasn't going to let Smith have the last word, not when the tables were so close to turning. Slowly, deliberately, he forced a weak cough, gasping for breath, as if the effort was costing him everything. The sound of his labored breathing filled the room, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might collapse into unconsciousness. But it was all part of the act. Every sound, every movement, every pause was calculated. Smith's gaze softened for a brief moment, as if he believed Sherman was truly nearing the end. "You should be grateful, Sherman," Smith said, his tone almost mocking. "This is the mercy I'm offering you. I could have left you to die a long time ago, but I've allowed you this final moment of recognition, of clarity. You're not even going to make it to the morning." Sherman's eyes gleamed with a dangerous resolve. He had been waiting for this. He had been waiting for Smith to let his guard down, to reveal his arrogance, his belief that he could get away with everything. Sherman's voice was faint, but the words were clear. "You're a coward, Callum. You're hiding behind a disease, behind a package, behind lies. But I know the truth, and when I die, it will come out. You won't get away with this." Smith turned swiftly, his eyes narrowing in anger. "You really think anyone will believe you, Sherman? You think anyone will listen to a dying man's last words?" His voice was thick with disdain. "You're nothing but a pawn in my game, and soon you'll be gone, and no one will be left to tell your tale." Sherman's pulse raced, the adrenaline beginning to course through him despite the poison ravaging his body. It was now or never. He had to push Smith into a corner, force him to slip, to expose his guilt. "I'm not the only one who knows, Callum," Sherman whispered, barely audible. "There's someone else. Someone who's been watching you." Smith's expression faltered for a split second, his gaze darting to the door, to the window. He was nervous now, a crack in his carefully constructed facade. Sherman knew it. He could see the shift in Smith's demeanor. It was small opening, but it was enough. "Who?" Smith demanded, his voice tight with suspicion. "Who else knows?" Sherman's lips twitched into a faint grin, his eyes glinting with the thrill of victory. "You really think I would trust you with that information? You think I'm just going to give up?" "No, Callum. You'll find out soon enough." Smith stepped forward, his expression a mix of rage and desperation. "Tell me who it is," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. But Sherman remained calm, his pulse steady. "You'll know when the time comes," he said cryptically. "But by then, it'll be too late for you. Smith's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out. But then, just as quickly, he reined himself in. His eyes scanned the room one last time, and Sherman could see the gears turning in Smith's mind. He was starting to realize that something wasn't right, that he might be walking into a trap. But it was too late for Smith to back out now. Sherman had already set the wheels in motion. "Fine," Smith said, his voice low and menacing. "You'll die, Sherman. And when you do, no one will care. I'll make sure of that." But Sherman's mind was already elsewhere, focused on the small, subtle movements that would signal Brennan to act. It was a simple plan, but a brilliant one. He had arranged for Brennan to be close, within earshot, ready to move when Smith gave the wrong response. And now, Smith had done exactly that. Sherman's hand trembled slightly as he made the signal, a faint flick of his fingers, barely noticeable, but enough to alert the inspector hidden outside. In the blink of an eye, Brennan would be on the move. Smith turned once more to face Sherman, his eyes filled with contempt. But Sherman's grin only deepened, as if the pieces were finally falling into place. "I'm not going to let you get away with it, Callum," Sherman said one last time. His voice was steady now, strong despite the poison running through him. "The game is up. You've lost." Smith's eyes widened, and for the first time, he seemed genuinely uncertain. But before he could react, the door burst open with a force that made Smith spin around. Inspector Brennan stood in the doorway, his hand firmly gripping his gun, his expression one of cold authority. "You're under arrest, Callum Smith," Brennan said, his voice clear and commanding. "For the murder of Sherman's nephew and for poisoning him. You're not going anywhere." Smith's face drained of color, his eyes darting around the room, but it was too late. The inspector's men were already closing in, ready to take him down. As Brennan advanced, Sherman allowed himself a moment of relief, knowing that his plan had worked. Callum Smith's reign of terror was over, and though his own life was slipping away, Sherman could die knowing that justice would be served. For all his pain, Sherman had orchestrated the perfect masterstroke, a final act of defiance that would haunt Callum Smith for the rest of his days. The air was thick with tension as Inspector Brennan stepped into the room, his authoritative presence filling every corner. Callum Smith spun around, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The smug confidence that had once dominated his every movement now crumbled in the face of the inevitable. Smith's mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came out. The realization hit him like a cold, hard wave. It was over. "Mr. Callum Smith, you are under arrest for the murder of Sherman Holt's nephew and for poisoning him with a deadly virus." Brennan's voice was steady, unwavering. "You will be taken into custody and charged accordingly." Smith took a step back, his mind racing for an escape that no longer existed. He had thought he had outsmarted everyone, believed that his elaborate plot was foolproof. But here, in this small, dimly lit room, the truth had come crashing down around him. Sherman, despite his weakened state, managed to sit up slightly in his bed, his eyes fixed on Smith. There was no fear in his gaze, only a quiet satisfaction. The battle was over, and he had won. The game of deception and manipulation had played out exactly as he had planned. He had outwitted the man who had tried to destroy him, using nothing more than his own wits and a carefully crafted illusion. Dr. Robert Fraser stood off to the side, his mind spinning. The relief that washed over him when Brennan had entered the room was palpable. His friend was alive, despite everything. But the revelation that Sherman had faked his illness was a shock he hadn't been prepared for. Sherman's voice, though weak, cut through the silence. "It's over, Callum. You're finished." Smith's gaze flickered to Sherman, disbelief still etched on his face. You faked it. All of it. You were never sick." Sherman's lips curled into a faint smile, though his body trembled from the effort. "That's right. I knew you'd try something like this. You always were too full of yourself, Callum. You thought you could pull the strings and manipulate everyone, but you underestimated me." Fraser couldn't help but stare in awe at his friend. All this time, he had believed that Sherman was fighting for his life. He had watched as his friend's health deteriorated before his eyes, had felt the helplessness that came with not being able to find a cure in time. But now, standing in the presence of this revelation, Fraser realized the depth of Sherman's intelligence. Sherman had played a long game, using his own suffering as the perfect bait to trap Smith. "You were never in danger, were you?" Fraser asked, his voice tinged with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Sherman shook his head weakly. "Not in the way you think. I had to make him believe I was dying, Robert. I needed him to drop his guard. I knew Smith wouldn't be able to resist his own arrogance. He'd get careless. And when the time came, he'd reveal everything." The pieces were starting to fall into place in Robert's mind. He thought back to the moments when Sherman had seemed too weak, too frail to survive. It had all been an act, a clever ruse designed to push Smith to make a mistake. Sherman had been playing the role of the victim, but behind those carefully feigned moments of vulnerability, he had been orchestrating Smith's downfall. Brennan's voice broke into their conversation, his eyes never leaving Smith as the officers moved to apprehend him. "You've got no escape, Smith. We've got enough evidence to bring you down. The truth's out now, and you're not going to worm your way out of this one." As Smith was escorted out of the room in handcuffs, Sherman's eyes met Fraser's. There was no trace of anger in Sherman's expression, only the quiet satisfaction of a man who had outsmarted his foe. "I knew you'd come through for me, Robert. You've always had my back." Fraser, still stunned by the turn of events, stepped closer to Sherman's bedside. I didn't realize. I thought I had lost you, Sherman. I thought I was too late." Sherman's smile was faint, but it carried the weight of years of friendship. "You did the best you could, but this was my fight, and you were never alone in it, Robert. You've always trusted me. That's what matters." Fraser nodded slowly, his mind grappling with the lesson Sherman had taught him. Trust, deception, and friendship. These were the things that had guided him through this perilous journey. And as he looked at his friend, he understood now more than ever how crucial it was to know when to trust, when to deceive, and how to fight back against the darkness that threatened to consume them both. As the door closed behind the officers and the sound of Smith's footsteps faded into the distance, Fraser and Sherman were left alone, the weight of the victory settling between them. "We make a good team," Fraser said softly, the words filled with a newfound respect for his old friend. Sherman's eyes twinkled with a quiet amusement. "We always have, Robert. We always have." Friends, subscribe to my channel. There are many more interesting stories like this. Do listen to them too, and thank you for listening to this story.